This is our panel 3 on the military implications of generative AI. So as you've probably gathered from the conference so far, the military has been very interested in artificial intelligence for a long time, but as Michael said during the keynote, generative AI, LLMs, is sort of a born in the wild technology. Obviously, the product of a lot of DoD investment. For many, many years, DoD, DARPA, the research enterprise the federal research enterprise were the primary funders of AI research. But then, kind of out of the blue, companies like Google DeepMind, OpenAI, cracked a new kind of artificial intelligence that was not necessarily on the 20-year planning trajectory for DoD weapons development. And so we're at this panel, we've got an amazing group of folks from across think tanks, private sector, and folks who have spent a career in DoD, and we're gonna talk about different aspects of how militaries, in particular, will adopt or deal with generative AI. So we have Mark Stewart. He's the director of national security within Microsoft Government Affairs, and he joined Microsoft last year, after more than 22 years in the federal government, serving in various roles within DoD and the intelligence community. We've got Emelia Probasco from the Senior Fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, where she studies national security applications of AI. And before she was at CSET, she was in executive leadership at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and before then, she was a surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. We've got Tyler Sweatt, who is the CEO of national security software company Second Front Systems, which I'll let him explain when we come to him. And he's a former military officer and technology advisor who spends his time exploring the implications of emerging technology in national security. And last but not least, we've got Mundy Reimer, who's a principal investigator of the Generative AI for Explainability project and an R&D scientist at Leidos Dynetics, focused on engineering AI solutions that address issues of explainability, interpretability, trust, and alignment as part of the autonomy and AI branch at Leidos. So we've got a really sterling panel here to address this, and we're going to try to get inside the black box of the DoD a little bit this afternoon. So, pardon me, I should have gotten my notes out before starting my intro. Okay. So we'll go in the order here. Mark, when many people think about AI and military applications, they're thinking about autonomy, they're thinking about command and control, and yet there's this whole other important aspect of actually doing military operations, which is training. And Microsoft has been very involved in simulation and training efforts within the U.S. military, and generative AI seems poised to sort of transform this. So what are the projects in Microsoft that you're most excited about, the applications you're most excited about for AI, both in the military and in the IC?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, John, and thank you for having me. And first of all, it's nice to be here and see you all. And my name is Mark Stewart, and as John had mentioned, I spent about 22 years in the government, most recently came from the IC and the agency. I've been at Microsoft for about a year. I mean, this is just a really incredible time to be thinking about and really understanding where generative AI is going. I mean, the conversation is obviously a deep one, and there's lots of pieces to it. And I imagine in today's conversation, you've been exploring all aspects of it. But when we think about what this technology can do and how transformative it is, particularly in the areas of productivity and the kinds of functions that it can perform that take things out of, I don't want to say out of human control, that's what we always think is human loop, but like some of these core functions of analysis, drafting, and certainly, as you had mentioned, in training and in simulations where you could use both audio and text and image, it's fascinating what this technology can do and how really revolutionary it is. But what I would like to say is we think it has a lot of applications, certainly to the DoD and the IC, and really will be transformative. But what we really need to be thinking about is how is the department, how is the intelligence community using this? I think they've been obviously moving forward in its use and adopting it, certainly with Task Force Lima in the department, and certainly there's been some uses as reported in the IC, for the IC in the news. But really, to understand this technology and to really grasp its potential, the department and the IC and our national security agencies, they need to be experimenting, they need to be using, they need to be adopting. And I think to understand this technology and its real import, we need to be using it more quickly, more expeditiously, and really playing with it. And what's that mean? That means starting today, right? I mean, the agencies need to be really employing this technology. With that, what I would say is it also requires good skilling, right? We need folks who understand how to use this technology, and you only get to know how to use it when you're playing with it, using it. And it also requires the infrastructure, the backbone of this technology, which, as many of you know, is high-performance computing. You need lots of GPUs, so you need a cloud infrastructure, essentially, and is, particularly in the DoD and in the IC, much of that is there. So it's a ripe opportunity for the Intel and department, the Defense Department, to be really exploring and using this technology. And so, with simulation and training, if you think about the technology as you understand it, there's lots of applications where it can be used to help service members train, both in different environments through, audio and text. And you can, use that in ways that can really simulate actual scenarios that would be very helpful.
I mean, both in your career in the Navy and since then, you put a lot of thought into what it looks like when these systems when we actually bring them with us to go to war. Captain Lugo this morning, mentioned the use of LLMs to review his 1,000 emails he would have received after being here this morning. But I thought to myself that's not that's what we would call in economics a partial equilibrium, right? The full equilibrium is he has 10,000 emails generated by LLMs that he, physically needs an LLM to, so you're going to have LLMs deployed on both sides of the information environment. When it comes to commanders exercising command and control with information streams 100, 1,000 times the density we see today, that can only be made sense of using these technologies, what does that do to the speed of warfare, and what are the pitfalls from how we may or may not adopt the technology?
Sure. Do I need the thing? I'll take one. Thanks. Thanks so much for the question, and thanks for inviting me. I think the question about how it gets actually deployed is a really interesting one, and the one that I tend to empathize with the most is the operational level of war, the 3- and 4-star commanders who have to deal with an incredible information environment and are attempting to make sense of not just where are my tanks and where are the other guys' tanks, but what is the civilian population doing? What do I understand about the terrain? What's going on with the weather? What do we have in the electoral cycle? There's so much that they have to consider. And the chart that I was thinking of this morning that I think John saw was if you've ever seen in about 2010, there was the counterinsurgency chart from General McChrystal in Afghanistan, which basically looks like you dropped a plate of spaghetti on the floor and then put some thought bubbles in it that were like civilian population and whatever. So the operational level of where those commanders are faced with such an enormous information problem that LLMs are so exciting. They are so sexy. And this is something that I think we have to empathize with their need to digest and really make sense of all of this information to act. And at the same time, they have to make sure to squelch the desirement a little bit and think about what in the military, what I was trained on were the capabilities and limitations. Every system that you are presented with, I was trained on the Aegis weapon system, has capabilities and limitations. Things it's pretty good at, things it kind of sucks at. Aegis sucks on a cloudy day. Otherwise, really great at shooting down incoming missiles. So with LLMs, where we are right now is that there's a lot of talk, a lot of excitement about where they could take us. They have capabilities like we've talked about with summation. We can sort of look at a large corpus of papers and start to understand at some level the summarization. We could use it for situational awareness if we're trying to look at social media to get a sense of what's going on in the social media environment. There are other really creative and exciting uses. There's a DARPA Reason project that actually challenges the way that an analyst is doing their analysis. So the analyst will kind of say, this is how I'm thinking about this problem. And the LLM will come back and say, you forgot this, or have you thought about this particular logical trap? So there are lots of really exciting and interesting uses. Those are the capabilities. But then there are the limitations. And this is where we get into some dangerous territory, because in the hype cycle about LLMs, we start talking about my personal favorite in the sense of scariest is COA generation, course of action generation. We're laughing because we know how hard this is. Course of action generation, if you think of it, if you're an operational commander, you look out on the field and you say, am I going to move this unit here or shall I move it there? And if I do it, am I going to win? That's generally what you want to know. Right now, there are advertisements, not just in the United States. We see this in Russia. We see this in China. Lots of people are excited about the potential to use an LLM so that it could potentially say to you, if you take action A, you have a 75% chance of winning. And it literally says 82% chance of winning. I don't know where they get this level of specificity, but it's a little scary. So there are limitations to these systems that are banging up against the huge desire for certainty at the operational level of war that I think as our military is excited to bring them on board, we have to think through many of those limitations. One of them that I'm hoping Mundy is going to talk about, and I've been warning him, is explainability. So sometimes if you ask an LLM to explain, how did you arrive at this particular conclusion? It will very confidently tell you not the right answer. It'll very confidently give you an answer that you will say, oh, that looks quite logical. I really like that. And it's not actually how it arrived at that conclusion. And there's some really interesting studies in the medical field about how that tends to screw with the way a doctor will make a decision. So we have to think through those limitations. And before I end on like a super sad note that everything's got limitations, I think there are ways to get through it. I think training is an enormously important part. Just as you said, the experimentation has to happen so that we get comfortable with the capabilities and the limitations. But then there's also all the typical stuff that the military does. I think often we have these conversations around technical specifications. How do we technically achieve accuracy? How do we technically achieve transparency or explainability? I think we need to have a lot of conversations about how do we get the humans invested in this process, either at a bureaucratic level, like standard operating procedures, rules of engagement, captain's battle orders. There are lots of different ways to help the humans deal with the limitations of the system. And I think with that kind of a pairing, we can sort of seize this opportunity that we are so excited to finally have. I'll leave it there.
That's great. Tyler, I'm really excited for you to talk about what you're trying to do and the role that generative AI might play in it. As many folks know, the internet was originally an ARPA project, then DARPA. The DoD has been using computers and network computers for a very long time. What that means is that there are parts of the U.S. code base that are older than I am and still running. So enormous challenges for actually modernizing software. And now we have a technology that has extreme potential for helping us do that better and quicker. So can you talk a little bit, Tyler, about what you are working on and the role that LLMs might play?
Yeah. Echo everyone else's sentiment. Thank you for having me. A little overwhelmed because everyone on the panel is way smarter than me. So I'll use smaller words and keep it super simple. We at Second Front are just trying to simplify how commercial grade cutting edge software is consumed inside secure boundaries, right? So instead of it being environment by environment, there's different design patterns and technical specifications and STIGs, and then an ISV or an application developer has to effectively run like an end-to-end deployment each time over and over and over. Single design patterns federated into multiple environments with a high degree of observability from a security and compliance standpoint. That's what we do. So we sort of sit in the middle between applications and end users on a whole bunch of different fabrics. From an LLM standpoint and sort of what it can do, I think there is, somewhat limitless potential of what it can do. If you're thinking about things like predictability of failure rates in certain environmental conditions, thinking about how we're starting to look at, things that Microsoft and your AWSs and a bunch of folks are already doing on how do we think about CV remediation, automated vuln sort of reconfiguration, things like that might not sound like super groundbreaking, but at scale are pulling like an exponential amount of inefficiency out of, a kill chain, a value chain, like pick your end thing you are doing. There's a ton, in some scenarios, upwards of 50% leakage on a per dollar basis as a dollar is deployed out from the government to go procure, deploy, and then employ a technical capability. If you map that chain from when that dollar goes out to every little nickel that gets chucked away and every man hour, person hour that gets chucked away, when you come back and that capability comes back up, in theory, to be able to generate and deliver an effect, it is not what was intended when that dollar was out. So we're trying to switch that. I think the challenge you run into is, and to use sort of the operational levels of war, and nice throwback to the McChrystal slide. I was in Afghanistan when that came out, and I said it to my friends, and I was like, this summarizes what we're trying to do here. I think we, like the royal we, often look at capabilities like this as this sort of like all-solving, all-seeing oracle, and like, hey, this will fix it. And we use that as like a shroud to maybe wrap some impotence around some simple blocking and tackling around how we think about like data accessibility and federation, how we think about trust and training at a human level, not training a human on technology, training humans on decision-making, on team building, because at the end of the day, what this becomes in like the purest operational scenario is a selector that can get switched or not switched. And then there's a human at the end of it that is either going to trust that light that goes on or not. And there is a defensive sort of resiliency side for us. There is clearly another side of that coin to project effects elsewhere. But I think, until the robot overlords come, we've just got to continue to invest in people making strong decisions and empower them.
So Mundy, Emelia did a really wonderful job walking us through the human dimension of command and control. But you've been working a lot on what you might call the technical dimension, the way that DoD is building interoperability within the battle space, and obviously the benefits. Some might argue the necessity of AI to make that program possible, but then also some of the limitations, especially around explainability. So could you talk a little about what you're doing in layman's terms and the opportunities and limitations of AI for this?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. This is a generative AI conference, and most of what we've spoken about today has been in the context of large language models. Now, many of you here have played with something like GPT or some GPT-like device, where the T in that GPT stands for the transformer architecture that is the basis for it. Now, I'd like to emphasize that these are language models, so they're trained on natural language text. And we as human operators and users, when we engage in these models, we are decently well at figuring out whether or not these models are grounded in reality, whether or not they say something truthful or not, ideally, right? And that's just from the sheer amount of practice that we have with text and natural language. But despite this, and this was brought up earlier, is we have problems with hallucination. And there might be some fixes we have with this, which was mentioned a little bit earlier. But we still have problems where models spit out something and we don't know necessarily if it's true or not. And it's under the guise of fact. Now, the way these models work, and I'd like to do a little bit of review after the excellent explanation from Dr. Boggs earlier, but it's relevant to the points I'm about to make, is that these transformer models are trained to create a sequence. And so the sequence could be like a sentence with a bunch of words as text. And the way we train it is we snip out portions of that sequence, and we try to generate those missing portions. Now, in other cases, we might snip off the end and keep on generating the rest of the sequence. Now, to give you a sense of the research directions going forward, because I have, my head is always in papers, code, and math. And so I kind of like sense the winds of how, researchers are going and what seems trendy. But to address problems like hallucination, many groups and many companies are spending a lot of resources trying to do something known as multimodal models. And so what they mean by that is instead of just a text-based sequence, they are trying to model things like images audio, video, or in the battle manager setting, which I find a lot of my stuff having applications towards. It can be RF data or the multitude of sensor data on warfighter units. Now, the main working hypothesis that the vast majority of researchers are going under is that they think by adding extra modalities or mediums like video or audio to the text will in a way constrain the model. So instead of like hallucinating, they might solve that hallucination problem by adding more data of a different kind. And you can think of this in the naive sense, it kind of makes sense, right? Whether you add, you watch a child riding a bike, and then you explain to someone else in natural language how to ride a bike because you watched a child ride a bike and the mistakes that child makes. Or conversely, you have a set of instructions and you like to show somebody how to do something, but you can only describe it via that text. And so you have something like video or images helping text, and text helping images. And so it is hoped by having multimodal models, we're able to cut down on the hallucination problem. But there is an alternative hypothesis, and one that's much less discussed, but is completely viable as its own, and it's not necessarily mutually exclusive as well. The alternative hypothesis is that by adding these extra modalities, in a way, you are adding extra degrees of freedom to a system. So, for instance, you think of this, sorry, this is a little bit abstract, but let's say you have like a pendulum going, and if you had another pendulum attached to that pendulum, you have a greater space at which you can swipe or find yourself in. Similarly, when you're trying to find truthful statements about the world, you have a space of solutions that you're trying to explore. And by having extra modalities or mediums, that space grows. And when it comes to the hallucination problem, one of the things I worry about is that having the space that's growing, you will get hallucinations that are in other mediums and modalities where we as humans aren't as good at sussing out. Like, we can't think in terms of things other than text. And these models might spit out hallucinations, which might be good as text explainers, but they are sacrificing these other mediums, which you won't know. And so the projects I address as part of my team, we approach this problem in two ways. One is we try to ground models. So what I mean by that is we want to embody models with some sort of notion of causality in the physical world. Traditionally, this is done with robotics or reinforcement learning. We want to imbue these models with some sort of sense of planning or interaction with the world so it can learn from mistakes. And two, which I think is very important, and it's been alluded to earlier, which is explainability and interpretability. So what I mean by this is that we would like to understand what the models are doing. A lot of these models are black box. They are very good at what they are doing, but we don't know why they are very good at what they're doing. And conversely, in times where they are bad at doing what they are doing, we don't know why. And it is up to us to even figure out where are they doing bad in. Sometimes the scarier thought is we might not even know when something is going wrong, right? These hallucinations might not even go undetected. So in those two areas of grounding models and model explainability and interpretability, these just form the core research threads which my team addresses.
That's a really helpful overview. When I put this panel together, I was thinking, wanted to get down and talk about all the really cool technology, simulated training environments, holodeck type stuff, battle space managers out of science fiction. And of course, the panel, who are full of people with real in the trenches experience, pushed back and said, look, what we need to talk about is, are we even going to use this stuff? So what are the barriers that you see to government adoption and usage, both organizationally within at the service and DoD level, and then at the kind of policy level? Mark, maybe we can start with you.
And that's would you like me to go first?
Yeah, Mark and Emelia.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question. One thing, just before I answer that, I want to just kind of talk about a couple things that were raised by my colleagues here. You're absolutely right, Mundy. I mean, look, the technology is not perfect, and no one would say it's perfect at the moment. It's evolving, but it's moving very quickly, right? And we also need to think about, and I think the department has done a good job of this. They've put out some studies and some pamphlet, some materials and a strategy for responsible use, right? We need to be thinking about this technology in a responsible manner, and when we use it, understanding that there needs to be some guardrails and we have to use it ethically. I think the department's been leading on that. I think the IC is doing similar things. So it's not perfect, but it is getting better. And as I like to say, and this will be my segue into the adoption issue, is the bell is rung. We cannot unring the bell. This technology is here. It's not going to leave our society. It's only going to be more prevalent, and it's only going to get better. It's getting better every month that we speak and think about it and talk about it. It's far better today than it was last year, and it was far better last year than it was 2 years prior. So it's getting better. And what does that mean? It means to really understand what it can do, we have to be using it and adopting it in the national security world. If you think about our adversaries that the country faces, they're looking at this technology in the same way we are, and they're using it and trying to use it. And if we're not using it at the same level and understanding how they're using it, and then understanding how we can use it to better our national security, we're at a disadvantage. What are the obstacles? I think what we're seeing at the moment is there's a lot of action on the topic. Obviously, it sees society, it sees the technological, the tech world. It's seized. Everyone's talking about AI. I mean, we're here having a conference on it. I think, though, it's also it's having leadership to actually get the technology in and actually pushing it forward so that you can find out how it can be used. I mean, the most important thing on this technology is use cases and experimentation. If you're not experimenting and trying it out and getting comfortable with it and understanding the limitations that my colleagues here have talked about, then you're never going to get comfortable with it. And we have to be using it. And I think it just takes leadership. I mean, I think it's leadership at the government level, at the policymaker level. I think it's also hopefully that the Hill will see that this is an important. I mean, I think they understand it's an important technology, but we need leadership probably from Congress, and we need leadership in the policymaking world in the executive branch. It's really just, I think, getting comfortable with the fact that it's not going to be perfect at the moment, but the more we use it, the more we try it, and the more we see its implications and use cases, the more we will realize how important this will be and how useful it will be for military and intelligence mission sets.
I think where to start? I think, first of all, you have to have the tech that works, and then the warfighters have no time or tolerance for technology that does not work in the field, and they have very unkind words to say about it. So I think that's step one. The point about experimentation and leadership is really important. I'm going to pull on, Jonathan shared with me a piece that he's been working on about how the Army tends to do warfighter innovation. And I've seen very similar in terms of AI innovation in the 18th Airborne. I think they've got really interesting work, part of their Scarlet Dragon exercise series. And they've got leadership. They've got the stars are behind it. You've got a fantastic colonel that's sort of leading the charge in the application of AI. And then you've got a DevSecOps kind of experimentation. So you've got the warfighters in the 18th Airborne. These are the guys that get called every time something goes wrong. They have a ton of operational experience. When you bring in the tech, and they've got 90-day iteration cycles with the technologists as in the room, where they're working together, and the operators say, hey, I saw this, I need this kind of help, and the developers are there saying, okay, let's work on it. And then key point, the test and evaluation guys from Morse Corporation are right there too. And so they're doing this constant iteration cycle. So there's a little bit of experimentation that's going on, but that's what I think you need to translate it from vague, general, cool idea to it's on the ground and somebody is actually using it. Let me say one thing just very quickly, and then I'll pass it on. But The one thing I do not think is inhibiting our use, and I will die on this hill, is our commitment to ethical principles. I think anyone who says, oh, we're unnecessarily slowing ourselves down because we're committed to ethical principles has fundamentally misunderstood what the American military is about. I realize that Russia and China are doing some experimentations in the field that would make all of us uncomfortable, and I don't think any of us should seek to imitate that.
I think one of the challenges as you're external sort of looking into the broader U.S. government, but like we'll just use defense for now, is an assumption that like a policy has transferability when it's written in the Pentagon or when it's written at some senior staff, right? Imagine a world where when there's a policy set and it goes out and it actually becomes 75 to 100 different local variances because everyone has a policy exemption. So I think there's an aspect of what's inhibiting it is there's policy fratricide and there's a lack of clean programmatic leadership sort of across the organization. And then you've got a high variance and risk tolerance. I think it might seem counterintuitive, but the folks that are closer to like the pointy end of the spear have a like really high risk tolerance, and are, the folks who are experimenting, meaning examples like you brought up where there is proximity of tested the T&E. They're not sending that away to some like mythical T&E god in the sky and it comes back 7 months later. It's real-time feedback. So when you can create situations like that, which again are predominantly at like the real sort of tactical edge, I think you see adoption and you see a way higher risk acceptance as you get closer to the Pentagon or closer to like a headquarters and nice walled offices and stuff. There is a very, very low risk tolerance and there's this pursuit of perfection. Some equilibrium in there we'll get to, but good is great in most cases with technology as it relates to military or national security, right? Perfect is never going to get there. And then to your point on ethics, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's an odd sort of weird situation that's been brought up where it's become this huge conundrum that is requiring sort of congressional oversight. And we're worried about a model where we're giving 18-year-olds guns and bombs and drones. But I mean, I get it. But yeah, it's gonna be pushing proximity and it's gonna be getting a lot of bureaucracy out of the way. Or we're just never gonna adopt it, right? We're gonna be whatever the generative AI equivalent to Cobalt is in 30 years. Like, we'll have some PM up here who's like, our program's the greatest, and they'll be running on whatever that is, so.
We'll have a PEO who slightly announces GPT-4 Gov edition.
Yeah, exactly right, yeah.
No comment on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you guys, you jumped the gun a little bit because my next question was going to be about the ethics side. So I'm gonna, since you gave that for the first overview, I want to ask a slight twist on the question, which is, what are things that because we embed our way of life, our values in our policy and our training for our soldiers and our education, because we have a system which on the whole actually trusts soldiers and civilians to act, to push his authority, responsibility, and accountability to the edge. What are applications that we can use this technology for that a authoritarian system can't? So you just use one very trivial example, like the Chinese, to my understanding, have had a really hard time rolling out like consumer AI image generation because it's really hard to get an AI not to generate any variation of Xi Jinping as Winnie Pooh. And any, DALL-E, if you put out DALL-E 2, China edition, and, some guy on the Chinese internet makes Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh, that's your head, right? So, the authoritarian attitude is hampering their adoption of the technology. So what are some applications that we have in line with our values, in line with our way of war and our way of life that we can use this technology for that you think would be harder for our authoritarian adversaries to use it on?
I can address that first. So the work I do has a lot of implications for battle managers, right? It's coordinating multiple warfighting entities on the battlefield and the logistics, where to send who, where. And one of the things we emphasize a lot in our group and our company as a whole is the human in the loop. So we emphasize having a person operating in tandem with some sort of AI system. And what I like to think about and how this won't necessarily work in other types of value systems that found in other countries is that we tend to, whenever we build out rules, laws, create organizations or technologies like AI, we, in a way, cede some of our agency to that particular tool, rule, law, or organization. And we offload not only physical work, but some sort of cognitive burden to that tool. And in a lot of cases, this erodes at our agency by the mere fact of interacting and being coupled to these systems. But I think one of the values we possess, and certainly a value we cultivate on our team, is having the AI system give back or cultivate agency in the user itself. So one of the things that, for instance, my explainability project works on is how to generate counterfactuals. So counterfactuals is just a fancy word for like a what-if situation or a possible scenario that human users, when tasked and underneath, time constraints, or they're tired, they're running on, caffeine, they might not be able to think of certain situations that would get them out of a scenario in some sort of battle manager setting. And the values we cultivate in and try to bake into our AI systems is for the AI system itself to make these what-if scenarios, make the user aware of these. And I think values like that, where it improves the human in the loop during the entire use, is a good way that we address the problem and that other adversaries might not even allow to be addressed.
Yeah. That's awesome. So we're going to start taking questions in a minute. But before we do, and while JC gets the mics ready, just kind of lightning round down the line. What is an generative AI application within the military enterprise that you're excited about? Possibility of. Mark,
you want?
you're on the spot, Mark.
Hey, there's lots. I really like the analytical function of generative AI, particularly if you're a military analyst or an intelligence community analyst. You think about the technology, what it can do, and how it can be really helpful to folks in that line of work, particularly because of the technological approach that generative AI. Do I not have my mic on?
We'll go down the line.
So anyway, that's the one I really think is really. I mean, I think it's spot on for generative AI.
Yeah, I think I might be more excited about HoloLens than you are, Mark. I mean,
you're.
They should hand the mic down there. Thank you.
Oh, they took it. Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, I'll tell you the one I've been watching. So every so often, with ChatGPT, if you're in the GPT Plus, they have the various GPTs, plural. And so every so often I'll go in and search for anything that's got Navy, Army, Air Force. I forgot to do the Marine Corps the other day. Don't tell my Marine friends. But you know what? Where in each of the services, what you can find is that they are automating their awards process and they're automating their annual review process. So you have to write these really obnoxious blocks where it's like, this year I did this amazing thing, and the game is to put as many adjectives in as you possibly can. And it's your creative, your English teacher's worst nightmare in terms of grammar. They're just terrible to write. Anyways, every service has an auto NAM for Navy Achievement Medal, or some whatever the Air Force, I think it's EOP. So there's a lot of that basic stuff. I will tell you the one proposal that I have heard that I got the most excited about was the authority to operate LLM. So ATOs are how you can get, you probably know more about this, how you can get your new software up and running on a particular system. They are horrendous, I am told, to get through. And wouldn't it be nice if we just had an LLM to like generate all the paperwork and then help us get it through? Those are the two that I'm excited about.
And I should say, when you say the services, you mean officers on those services on their own initiative, right? It's not an official effort in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think if you think about, when I talked about earlier about how like data isn't federated really well, it's not discoverable, it's like this big knowledge management, just disaster in duty. Think about the personnel cycle and how they recycle, every 2-3 years, we're bringing in new command teams. There's like a 2-week handover and a little bit of a high five. You read some slides and then you go on your way. And there is just this massive leakage, like compounding of institutional knowledge and a learning that's not transferred. So the ability to start to make sense of some of that and give new commanders, new command teams, maybe those with less experience, an opportunity to engage with, interact with, and derive some insight from some learnings that have already occurred but have not effectively sort of been transferred through, the institutional processes.
So something I really enjoy and am really excited about I enjoy a lot of the tools and the affordances and possibilities that are being opened up with these LLMs, but I kind of am more excited about the practical experiments that have so far and way in the past been just relegated to thought experiments by philosophers. And that is mainly the question of how much can reality be captured by language itself? Can we capture an underlying causality or an underlying mechanism purely through language? And I see large language models as playing out those experiments. There's tremendous use cases and tools, but I'm more excited about that philosophical question that might be asked.
Yeah, Heidegger famously said that language is the house of being, and it's like a weird observation to be proven basically empirically correct by this breakthrough. Okay, so we're ready for some audience questions. If not, I will keep pepper. We have some over here. Thank you. Start with the gentleman in the dark shirt.
Hey, so I guess my question is there a real concern for, data security, not in the sense of like network security, but in the sense of like if, say, someone just like drops an EMP near your like server center or cloud center, you wouldn't have access to any of your information, and your platforms would be inaccessible. Like, is that a real concern for national security, or is that not something that would even be like a consideration?
Can I address this one really quick? Okay. So right now, one of the major concerns for both the academic and industry communities is like this edge computing framework. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have your phone or some sort of a device that doesn't have as much computational power, and we would like to train models and have these models work based upon all of the sensor data from all these phones. And usually how that's done is it's done centrally in some sort of cloud or server. And unfortunately, like you said, there are problems out in the field if some of the sensor data intermittently goes out or is lost due to an EMP or something. And what do we do in those scenarios? So there are models being built that try to handle this particular situation where you have a changing number of inputs, some that may not be reliable. How do you assign scores to that? Should you even train on data that disappears, or how do you infer some of that? So there are things that are trying to address it.
Yeah, just to add, like at a macro level, you can get into like a degree of continuity of operations planning for like, infrastructure degradation or availability zones. And then from data privacy, I think that is one of the broader concerns, especially as you're seeing a rise of sort of commercial tooling and applications. There is usually, think about when the average consumer sort of finds the next like Candy Crush. Nobody reads the terms. They're like, oh yeah, this is sweet. And nobody has any idea like what real access is on their devices, just at a personal level. So when you've got maybe a somewhat permeable boundary between what is controlled unclassified information or like mission system information, I mean, DoD can't agree on what IL4, IL5 actually is. Then what's getting put into what systems and where that may be going and how that can be then reconfigured and used to derive some insight by an adversary. Yeah, pretty material concern. And then last part on the edge, sort of going back to your question or your point about like infrastructure availability and like, is there capacity? I think one of the challenges we're gonna run into is just contested spectrum. I mean, the DoD for the last, 24 years has struggled to execute a war where no decks were contested. When you could argue the ground was to a degree. And we struggled to have persistent communications and data exchange. And so there is a lot of promise about things we're going to be doing at the edge. And there are all these great programs about like new drones and flying robots and sharks with laser beams. But peel that back and ask what happens when, and like how are we thinking about auth and IDAM and handshakes and ensuring that data hasn't been poisoned, and then what if there's latency issues, what data is getting pulled back on what selector, and there's not a lot of answers. And I'll just, not to leave it as a dark, but that is one, something we're working on trying to solve, but two, like should be a huge point of concern for extensibility for all of this.
I mean, you said it great, but can I just add in the data issue, because this one really bugged me. If you saw the Duke study, where there were some Duke researchers who were able to go to third-party data vendors and buy a lot of data about military members, veterans, and their families. That, to me, is a huge concern, and we need to be thinking about the targetability of families as well as military members at home.
All right. Micah and then Charles.
So sort of extending Tyler's comment about continuity of institutional knowledge, would there be any use case? I mean, we have a few thousand years of reflections by military leaders. We've got some verbose American generals from the 20th century and even presently. I mean, is a like Ultimate Warrior chatbot going to be of any utility? You just go to the Oracle and ask General MacArthur what he would do.
I would have loved that when I was at West Point instead of muddling through like Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and all of that, right? Because ask anyone who's been forced to read The Art of War, or But I think there is an aspect of that from a learning and taking sort of like military art. To your point, there is like fantastic literature. There is a really simple way to think about contextualization around that and build that into training. And there's already, the sort of software applications and mobile applications for easy sort of on-the-go, self-paced training that have proven awesome yield. I think it's yes and. So I think you've got that, and then the ability to bring something like that in at an organizational level. So like, when I take over Squadron X, I'm not continually for the first 6 months asking, one of the NCOs or junior officers who'd been there, maybe on the last jaunt or one before. You don't have to go find the old timer and be like, hey, where do we do this? How do we do this? You're able to sort of get on that on your own and start to build your own perspective going forward.
Just to add in here, I mean, what you said, Tyler, about this is actually hugely exciting for me. I study, one of the things I study is military learning organizations. And one of the things you realize is that the U.S. military in particular has this elaborate lessons learning enterprise, which is really good at collecting data and terrible at disseminating it. I have never once met an operational commander that actually used lessons learned, like went back to the
I've given interviews to that organization and I don't know where they go.
Yeah.
I was like, hey, this is awesome. How do I get these from other orgs? They were like, we don't know. I was like,
yeah, that's
sick.
exactly right. So, I mean, you could imagine Senator Reimer lessons learned building lessons learned GPT and then suddenly, it's actually an extraordinary use case for it. Yeah. Charles?
Yeah. I'm sort of thinking of a way to combine the discussion about ethics and sort of language and comprehensibility in terms of responsibility. So whenever you have a new sort of tool that gives you a way of understanding the information, organizing the information, that changes the dynamic of sort of where the buck stops when a particular decision is made. So I'm trying to think of, a commander who makes a decision. He makes a decision based off of what these new AI tools are telling him, or he chooses not to. He did, for time or whatever reason, he chooses not to. And then the conversation afterwards where it's like, why did you choose to do this? And it failed. And he goes, well, it's what the tool told me to do. Or I chose not to because I've had bad experience with the tools, telling me you have an 82% chance of winning when it hallucinated and should have said losing. So I'm sort of curious how sort of the dynamic of responsibility, sort of the coordination of responsibility is changed with this new non-human simulacrum of a human sort of is in the room there.
There are a lot of ways to go with this. This is a great question. So let me first say that the Deputy Secretary wrote a responsible AI memo, and in that there is one principle in particular that I tend to think about in the responsibility chain that has to do with traceability. That's the word. Traceability, and this is a language problem that we have writ large, but in the DoD context, you can think of traceability in part as, I want a chain of custody, who made what decision, when, why. And culturally, in the U.S. Armed Forces, we take authority and responsibility extremely seriously, especially at the command level. Commanders know that they bear that responsibility. And so in a study I did when I was back at the Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, we were looking specifically at, would a commander actually ever use this because they are terrified of making the wrong decision as a consequence of the way that the computer has guided them. I don't know that we have answers to that yet. I will point you, though, we've been through versions of this before. The one that I'm a SWO, so I'm going to think about the Vincennes incident where we had an Aegis destroyer shoot down an Iranian civilian aircraft. There was, at the time, the thought was that the system had sort of done what's called a track swap, where they saw a military aircraft and then accidentally swapped it with a civilian aircraft. Turns out that actually wasn't the problem. It had more to do with the operator. Anyways, there are a lot of lessons learned, and we read those very carefully because none of us want to be that. No one wanted to be that guy. This is a long-winded way of saying your question is really important, and it's one that folks are thinking a lot about, and I don't know that we have a really settled answer yet.
Yeah, I would just follow on, and I completely agree with Emily. I would just say it goes back to the concept that Mundy had mentioned earlier, and I think I mentioned as well, as human in the loop, right? I don't think there's anybody that says that this technology should take over human decision making. It's to help human decision making, right? I mean, if you really think about generative AI and what it can do, it's to help the decision making process. So in the same context, certainly in the military where you have a chain of command and there's responsibility in the decisions that are rendered day in, day out, the decision rests with the person who is charged with the decision. This tool hopefully will help that person and that commander in this context make a right decision. Now, if the information is not helpful, it's up to the commander to determine what decision he or she should make. But I really think we should think about this technology as not letting a human not be in the loop. A human has to be in the loop. We think that's critical. I think it goes back to kind of some of these principles of ethical and responsible use of AI. I think fundamentally always will have a human in the loop who's going to make the final call, certainly in the military context.
Just as an interesting, not a counterpoint, but a counter thought is I agree. And I mean, able wingman and like loyal wingman are perfect proxy sort of examples of like autonomous flight and co-pilots and adoption. And then how does the Uniform Code of Military Justice apply if X or Y? And it's super confusing. I agree with the intent of human in a loop. I think that is a fundamentally unscalable approach to near peer or actual great power conflict, and I worry that there will be an operational event that will force us to let go of that, and I think we are far closer than we want to admit to having fully autonomous kill chains. I give it back to you. Sorry.
Quite the thought. Do you have any more questions from me? Yep, over here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. My concern is something called Captor, an encapsulated torpedo that sits on the seafloor. And in this age, with a sufficient database of acoustics, that torpedo can identify a U.S. ship and take off from the seafloor and hit it without any human intervention whatsoever. And I believe that the United States may follow this technology itself, but leave the man in the loop. But I promise you, the People's Republic of China will not do so. And any attempt to put guardrails on Chinese military technology where automated weapon systems will fail. And so I want to know what to do about that.
That's great
Question from Microsoft.
Well, while our panelists gather their thoughts, one thing I think is important is context. A lot of our thinking about human in the loop really was driven by the GWAT, right? The Global War on Terror, with hyper-specific signature strikes, with huge manpower advantages, huge technological advantages in contested, often urban environments, right? We're not really that worried once a shooting war starts in the South Pacific about civilian casualties, about understanding the urban terrain. So I do think context matters a lot, geography matters a lot. There are going to be some geographies in which the appropriate level of human in the loop is not at the kind of 02, 03 level, is more at the 05, 06 level. Not that I don't know if we're building in this direction yet, but I think that's kind of in my mind, Tyler, that's kind of the equilibrium of your response. But to the question about Chinese C4 torpedoes, do you have Emily, do you have thoughts?
I don't ever want to be in a race to the bottom on these technologies. So let's say that they are doing that. What do we do about it? Well, I don't think we build our own autonomous torpedo that has some pre-programmed logic that we don't have some amount of control over. You do have, as you are well aware, weapons postures, and based on the context of the situation, we will turn things on and off depending on what we know that's going on in the world. I would presume they would do the same because no one really wants to accidentally start World War III. But on top of that, there are other things we can do. We can purposefully mess with the acoustic environment in order to create decoys. And I think there's been interesting work that's done in decoys. There is all sorts of different ways in which we can make China, and this is a lot of our strategy, doubt their ability to actually ever use their technology successfully against us. So I think deploying different countermeasures is a different way. I don't think it's a good idea to have any kind of a dead hand switch like the Russians did, this notion that, if you shoot us, we'll just blow up the world. I think that's, we don't want to be in mutually assured destruction. And there are a lot of ways for us to avoid it. And some of it is technical and some of it's strategic and a lot of it's probably diplomatic, honestly. You got to answer?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say, we're probably splitting hairs, but there's a degree of that we already do and have been doing for 30 years where, we have different frequency mines and stuff like that. There's a scale and magnitude and I don't know, there's probably another word aspect to it that, we'll be able to say is different, but I think it is around degrading trust, right? There's an asymmetric aspect. We've been a sort of big player for the last however many sort of eons and have been dealing with sort of asymmetric responses to new capability generation. It would probably do us well to invert that relationship a little bit from a cost standpoint.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Becky, with that? Yeah, one more question back here.
Hello. I just want to thank you guys for coming out. I'm a student here, so my question was more on ChatGPT. And just 2 weeks ago, they changed their terms of service to allow for military use. So I was wondering what it looked like before 2 weeks ago and what it looks like in the past 2 weeks for military use.
So they took out the phrase, there was a specific paragraph with a couple of bullets that said you're explicitly prohibited from using ChatGPT for military or weapons purposes. That was where they were before. I think it's now military's out entirely, but I still think there's something about weapons. So what does that mean? Well, what we've heard in the press, which is a way bigger conversation than we have 6 minutes for, is that you have to remember the military is a massive bureaucracy. If you were to look at, I was just doing a study on all the DoD's research, a huge amount of it's on health, just because we got to run an entire health system for veterans and their families as well as military members. So OpenAI might be looking to partner with the Department of Defense on creating chatbots for veterans for sort of treating military members and their medical issues. So that's, one of the many reasons why they may have taken military out. But I think there's a really interesting, if I can back up a little on your question, we have enormous capability in our private sector companies. Microsoft is actually a real leader in this. They have enormous power. And they are being faced with choices about, will I partner with the Department of Defense or will I help Ukraine, which Microsoft did? They can play in these conflicts in a way now that they could not really play before. It's not like it used to be if you're Ford, you have to ship the tank over. Now these guys can be in the field of operations in seconds if they so choose. And so as we continue down this pathway of having software and AI be militarily relevant, these companies are having to make really interesting choices about how and when they will partner with what particular military. So I think it's a really, really interesting question that you ask.
And if I can jump in on this too, I don't think I'm betraying any confidence here. I know also that from conversations with folks in OpenAI as of this summer, there's these concerns about weaponization, but there's a bigger barrier from their standpoint, which is that based, at least as of before the events of this summer, last few months, those who are following OpenAI, their philosophy is very much that they want to continue to control the model, and I don't know how this reflects the relationship with Microsoft. This is just OpenAI. And so I think that the kind of architecture that they would need to deploy their products in secured environments, they're not willing to undertake. And so now they might change with competition. I don't know how this affects their partnership with Microsoft. But I think, as Emmy said, that terms and conditions change, which is much more about other applications. In a military environment, models that can be run in a secure environment and that can be adapted in a secure environment are much more important. So Llama 2 and other open source models, I think, are going to be, at least at first blush, much more likely to be implemented within some of our DoD applications, including weapons applications. Oh, I don't know if you want.
I would just say, first of all, obviously, as you know, Microsoft is a significant investor in OpenAI. OpenAI is a separate company, so they can make their own policies with respect to their GPT. The company I work for, Microsoft, it has a policy of not using its technology for kinetic purposes. So in the instances that you discuss, that's not something that we are involved in, although we are a strong partner with the Defense Department and certainly the national security agencies of our country. We want to be right there with them and helping them solve the challenges of today and tomorrow. But the one thing that our technology is not, we don't get involved in is its use for kinetic purposes. That's just something that, as a policy on our company, we just don't do. So I just want to make that point clear.
All right, can we thank our panelists for an excellent panel? Yeah.